We just had a bit of a work session in the morning because we had a bunch of folks flying in, and we were actually talking about something that I'm very much looking forward to everybody here getting into, which was execution, which is probably the best word that you can get to. So maybe before I start talking about execution, I just want to spend a bit of time and maybe talk a bit about the mindset shift of where TODA took us, as far as saying, what is the world we're going to go into? And it doesn't just happen, so what's the world we're trying to build? So TODAQ Financial was a little bit about saying, how do we help businesses, large and small, and consumers rethink about how they can store any asset of value and maintain that privacy, that security, and that ownership, put the pendulum back where it should be, take a lot of the transactional friction that TODA naturally removes, and bring it to markets where that brings the most effect, which really for TODAQ we just call the belt and road. Depending on whom you ask in the world what the belt and road is, you'll get a different answer. But I give you the broad one. Think of the trading bloc and the trade routes that extend from Korea through China, down through Australia and Southeast Asia, into the Middle East, and then across into the African markets. And that was really looking and recognizing that you have very large and growing markets and populations where you can take a solution. And a little bit when we started, we had a bit of talk around the bank of the future. Because that was certainly one place that you could bring some really new solutions in for business and in for populations. But we got into a bit of a discussion of what does bank of the future mean? And I'll just leave you with a couple of sort of end conclusions of where that brings you to. The first is convergence. If I was IBM, I would tell you, hey, we're going to store your data for you. We're going to do some analytics on it and bring out some insights, and we're going to move your data around for you. And for that, we're going to charge you some fees, and you're going to derive some value. And JP Morgan shows up and says, we're a bank. We're going to store your data for you. We're going to do some analytics and move that data around and give you some insights. And we're going to move it around the world for you as well. So what then is the difference between JP Morgan and IBM, apart from the fact that one is money and one is everything else? I'd submit to you that in a TODA-based world where you can put any asset on chain and it becomes decentralized and its transactions become more frictionless, that line becomes increasingly blurry as far as what is the operative difference between the two. I'd also then ask you about something like finance. If I looked at a bank and I thought very simply what a bank is, well, a bank then is holding deposits for you. It has a license given to it by its sovereign and by some supranational organizations that are saying, hey, we're creating a base money supply. You can take that and leverage it to create more money in the form of debt, which you'll lend out. And on top of that, you're going to provide some transaction services and some investment services in a centralized way that you'll charge fees for. And that front to back is a bank. But if I pose the same kind of questions again, I'm not so sure what a bank is anymore either. Because in the world we're going into, the bank isn't holding and owning your deposits, you hold your assets. The idea of a fractional reserve system that you're using to actually leverage to create a money supply or a store of value or a medium of transaction starts to look a little archaic and inefficient. Especially when you can now directly tie tangible and intangible assets to those mediums of transaction. It then ends up looking a little bit stranger when you recognize that a lot of those transaction and investment services are no longer there because they're inherent to how the decentralized system operates. And then what's left you can think about in a much more open market manner. And I put these out as both philosophical and real questions because where we came from as we proceeded through it, it very much changed our view of the world, of what ownership was, of where value was, of how we were going to provide value either to businesses or citizens. So I just throw out a couple of those examples because in our path on the TODAQ side, we ended up in a very, very different place. So as I talk through the TODAQ business, who we are, what we're doing, what are some examples of some problems we're solving, and what are we up to right now? There's a bit of these, as I said, both philosophical but very real questions. And I challenge everyone here because I've had the opportunity to hear kind of a bit of the great ideas and platforms that are coming forward. But would really push everyone to say, you know what? Challenge yourselves, go a step or two further. Because the further you dig in, the more you'll find that you're going to be able to do and think about things that aren't possible in what I think of as the legacy world. So that's just kind of a bit of a start. Hold on. I think the first thing is, in TODAQ, maybe the first thing I'll do to describe what we do is then describe what we won't do, or what we won't charge for. In the TODAQ world, if you have an account, and we actually ended up calling it an inventory, because a wallet was limited. And when we actually used the word inventory, people's mindsets started to shift and expand. They no longer started thinking about money or tokens or things like that. They actually thought about everything and all the assets that they used in their commercial, personal, and corporate lives. But for an account or for locally owning any of those assets, that's no longer something that we charge for, ever. Because we are going to a place where, as an intermediary, you're not providing value by doing that. And we said we always wanted to be able to provide sustainable value to people or to businesses. And then the second is, if you decide to do a one or a two-way transaction with anyone else, that is also not something we are ever going to charge for. Even if in the beginning we looked and said 0.1% of the world is using TODA or something TODA-like, we're not going to do that. Because the end game is very clear. There is no value or business there either. So now we've got to go and find where we truly are delivering that kind of value. So what it really meant for TODAQ was if that base thing becomes like air, it's essential. You need it like oxygen, but if I looked around the room and I asked anyone here, what if I charged you 0.0001 cents for every breath you take? There's no price that is low enough that I can go to where I would get a taker who will buy unless air somehow became constrained in our environment. So it's essential, but again, we're not charging anything. For TODAQ, it came to two things. For enterprises, for small businesses, and for consumers, it is around creating the on-chain assets that they're transacting with in a marketplace. And it's putting the ability in their hands to generate those assets and life cycle manage them throughout their existence. And second, there are services around those assets that we provide. Particularly on the finance and insurance side, let's think about a few examples of what are the things that we solve within the blockchain and what are the remaining frictions or problems that are left that you can add value on top of. Because one of the things is we get something new and exciting and truly transformative that comes in. Excitement occurs. And then it can make your coffee, it can cure cancer, it can do everything. And it's like, no, it's revolutionary, but it does certain things very, very well, and there's other things that it doesn't. And we started then building a business in a complementary way, looking and saying, what are the things we're adding on top of the protocol that are now truly going to add value? So, Dan has a car. He's got a Honda. Is that true?
No.
Well, what is it?
I could.
Okay, let's say you could have a Honda. So Dan is going to sell me his Honda. So Dan now, in his TODA node, has a registration that then says, you know, I own this file and it's his ownership of his Honda and it's got the VIN number and the serial numbers of all the pieces that make up this Honda and the factory it was done, and there's the proof of ownership history of going from the factory onto the ship and then to the dealership, and then was owned briefly by the bank, and now Dan has it and now he's going to sell it to me because I need a secondhand car. And the nice part about that is the entire disposition of that ownership is now captured in an immutable way on the blockchain. And he and I can then do a two-way transaction where I say, Dan, I've got these $15,000 that I'm going to send you for your Honda. It's a really good Honda. Dan took care of it well. He didn't spill chips in the back, nothing. It's in pristine condition. We still have a problem. Because I'm like, Dan, you are not a AAA rated counterparty. We work together all the time. How do I know, this thing wasn't caught in an ice storm in Alaska? You didn't drive it through Manitoba and it got stuck in a flood, right? And it was in the Red River, and then you pulled it out and blow dried it, and then it kind of showed up, and you're like, great, I've got the digital asset coming across, but the actual physical good I'm receiving is not that thing. So now we have a delta in terms of the residual risk. Well, there's been a little talk of other things if we think about insurance. So on the insurance side, if you could then take a physical good and bind an insurance file to it, I've now taken care of my counterparty risk. So that is a very quick example of what we mean by services around assets. And there are a lot of services around assets. Particularly for TODAQ, we look and say, what are the risk mitigating assets, mitigating services, and the enabling services that allow for international trade between enterprises, small business, and consumers to happen. So from that, what we get is kind of saying, well, hey, TODAQ, what do you do? And it's like, I was actually talking with a business partner investor today who actually came from the media, music, and Hollywood kind of world, and really boils everything down to like these simple things. So now I like just telling him stuff because I've got the, the consultant, engineer kind of brain. I make things needlessly complicated, right? And he looked and he's like, oh, got it. So you guys are like the engine room and the umbrella, right? And I was like, that's actually really cool. So what's the engine room? What's the umbrella? What TODAQ is the engine room is a platform as a service and digital asset management. So if you're an enterprise or a company, we are basically providing that blockchain transaction layer as well as the ownership of the asset layer, so that within their ecosystem and down their supply and distribution lines, that is that layer that sits and allows the transactions to happen in an efficient way, in a way with far greater auditability, traceability, and trust, with that data being ripped up into their ERP and management systems. So from then what they get is greater insight, along with a whole bunch of cost savings, depending on the market and sector they're in, a lot of reduction in leakage and other things. And on top of it, we're like, fantastic, we're going to give you the platform so that you can generate your digital assets, have your own registry and lifecycle management capability for those things. So very much what I have described to you is around platform and product. And in the beginning and in the phase we are now, there's certainly aspects of it that is more what I'd call solutioning and service. But as far as what we are developing into, it's entirely those two things, which is an engine. And as I will get into a little more sort of down the road, a lot of the international enterprise partners we have, whether they're in healthcare or in education, what they're looking at doing is building their stack on top of the engine, because they have their expertise and their domain depth within their particular spaces. So where's the umbrella? Well, the umbrella is those insurance and financial related services that sit on top, that then de-risk and enable the trade in those assets inside the enterprise ecosystem, up and down their supply chains, or with their counterparts in other markets, right? So then the education company says, fantastic, we have 1 million students, and we have 200,000 teachers or 100,000 teachers, and we've got a flow of students and parents and everything, and now we've got a massive deal that we do with OneWorld and Skyward and Star Alliance. And now what's happening is within that deal we are passing value and loyalty points and airline points, and everything is flowing back and forth, including the tickets. Right? So that's an example now looking at the cross-ecosystem side of things. So TODAQ is really just two things: engine room, umbrella. And the umbrella keeps the rain off of that engine and allows the trade to flow. And everybody builds their things in between. If I kind of went down to a little more gory detail, you know, between large companies, SMEs, kind of consumers, it seems like a very broad spread of stuff, right? But what all this is basically showing is that it's all just aggregations of nodes. If I'm holding my phone and I have my account on one node, right? Suddenly I'm a company and we're all this table and we're a bunch of nodes interacting. There's a certain aspect to the scaling of it that is and the architecture of it that is very, very different from how you think of the old centralized server-based world. So yes, is there additional engineering services value around a platform for an enterprise? Yeah, but between a person and the other, the gap is now much, much smaller. And there's some things, you know, like I mentioned, that we don't charge for that are free. Like as an example, anyone having a single node, onboard your account, you have it, own what you want, transact what you want, we'll never charge you, right? But on the other hand, if we're building out or having the entire platform for you or other services you're consuming, then there is actually a thing. So as I mentioned, for enterprises, cost savings, auditability, traceability, the cross-ecosystem interoperability I talked about. And the starting partners that we're going with, they all have a vision, which is the great thing. And the nice part was that when we first started building and creating things within the Canadian market, the North American market, and looking at CD, there was a lot of opportunity where we went to say, where can we move the needle the most? And what we found is when we went across the pond, we found enterprise partners in education, healthcare, logistics and transportation, hospitality, energy, infrastructure, all of whom, when they looked underneath and saw what the potential of protocol was, went and understood the engine room and the umbrella and then said, wonderful, here's what we want to build within our space. And those are the starting partners who are also our investors as well. So there's kind of an alignment on both sides that we're building and growing with. And the nice part is that on both our side and their side, there's value going both ways. But there's no sense of elbows being up or cannibalism or risk of those kind of things. So a really good partnership. On the SME and marketplace side, we've got a first version of a marketplace app that we've kind of gone and pushed out. And over the summer, we're hoping to get everyone on it too, so you can try it, which would be awesome. So everyone can start transacting. As well, there is a means that we go and push it out where we've got our own digital asset, which is the asset-backed TODA note, which literally algorithmically goes out to everybody. So as soon as you onboard, you get a certain number of TODA notes. As you do work to grow your network and actually do commercial transactions, you earn a lot more. And that note has an asset backing, which means that its volatility stays within a bound, so it's actually useful. So we started doing our first commercial transactions last month. And over this month, we're building on to add about 20 different more use cases of trade in goods and services using a TODA-backed asset. So I'm going to fire through a few things. Adam, are you there? Where are you? You're come on up. So one of the interesting parts is that as we've been building out the TODA protocol version 1 and kind of putting that into effect, there's a few features, capabilities, other things we've been kind of layering, adding in. I don't know if you want to talk through that and some other things that might be helpful for the group.
Sure. So this is effectively our first sort of TODAQ tech update, which we've been kind of mum about in the past. So I'll see how much I can describe briefly. When you start with a spec, especially one that's iterating quite quickly and with a lot of new ideas, you have a lot of leeway in implementation. So of course we went to the nth degree and went with a cross-compiled Lisp thing that runs on a mobile device and on the server and all over the place, as you do. But the main challenge that we had was that we wanted and we needed TODA to run mobile first. And so those of you with cryptographic backgrounds understand that crypto and computational energy and battery life are not always compatible. So the main challenges we had initially, and this was over a year ago now, was ensuring that we were able to get the implementation to a place where that worked. That really, where you define work as in being able to run a reasonable number of transactions over a long period of time without destroying your phone. So we did. We had our first release, our first device-to-device transaction over a year ago, and we've been iterating both on our own implementation and recommending protocol changes or implementation notes back up to the TODA team, kind of on a week-to-week basis. It's been interesting. We're working on a number of different things going forwards. Right now we're relying on a single file type, nothing to do with the underlying implementation. That's just a client app UI side of things. So the items that you see on here don't necessarily represent where we're at with the protocol implementation. Similarly with the ecosystem size, a lot of those are specific to TODAQ Finance. But since we're the first folks actually implementing the protocol, we do hit a number of sort of interesting places along the line. So things that we're working on right now involve kind of raising those multiple file types so that people can exchange, effectively arbitrary content over this TODA network. We're working on splitting those files, which makes sense in certain domains. We're working on two-way atomic transactions, which is something we actually had early on, and then due to efficiency and implementation issues, we ended up changing our approach on. But I think the lesson that we've learned is really that, just that our approach, that collaborating closely with TODA and keeping to a mobile-first approach has been very rewarding. It limits the complexity that we can introduce into the implementation. We try not to introduce anything on a CPU heavy or a server side that would limit what we're doing on the phone. Sorry, Sophie, I'll speak up. Anyway, we have a lot underway. There's a lot of things that I'm trying not to say just yet, but we have been able to verify a number of important properties of the protocol, which is really exciting. We have some very good numbers on throughput. We have some very good numbers on the size of transactions and how we scale in terms of really huge P2P transactions and what the impact of that on the network is. So for those of you who will be using and implementing this protocol soon, I can tell you that the outlook is very good.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. So we've got, just to wrap it all up, we've got multiple first markets that we're going into. Canada, the US, Dubai, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UK, and Seoul just to start. There's a massive number of markets after that, which are also possible that we're kind of looking at. As one example, within Dubai, we've got 3 different enterprise partners, SMEs, investment partners, integration into the government. That's all happening. So typically when we look at a market that we're going into, we want to find multiple places where we can bring every aspect of both the engine and umbrella to clients large and small when we first go, and it allows us to concentrate force, save some costs, get efficiencies, everything else, when we actually commercially roll out. So I know the team is very excited because they're going to be in the desert in the summer, right? Which is very, very pleasant. The other nice part is, just some stuff on projects, is at least right now with the partners we have, we've got a clear view to get us to the first 10 million nodes. And the way I describe that in terms of a clear view is that if we did nothing else but work with the existing partners we have now, we would get to our first 10 million nodes. It's a good place to be in. So what keeps me awake at night? Execution, build a team, more speed, quality, build it right so that once we're through that first phase, we can scale very smartly. And then that's why I'm also so happy to see all of you here, because the more counterparties there are within the market who can take a transaction or a trade or whatever it happens to be on the other side, the better it is for us, the better it is for you, the better it is for everyone. So again, super excited. Big thank you to Tufi, Dan, and all of you. Love to take questions.
So actually we're going to take a 5-minute break. There's drinks in the back. If you have questions, please come up and ask them to Hassan. I think Tufi has something he wanted to say. Yes. I just wanted to say really quickly before we take a break. Tufi and I have been working with Hassan and also Adam for over a year now. And it has been so much fun. It's been amazing to watch this team bring the TODAQ protocol out to the market in such a vigorous way. And yeah, I'm incredibly excited about it and enjoying it every day.
So I guess it's pretty easy to digitize assets that have a serial number. We discussed that with Dan yesterday. And I have 2 questions. If I want to digitize precious metals, and I want to have asset-backed anything on that and get money out of it, how would I give credibility to that towards third parties, according to the price, according to the quality, to the fact that I really own it? And secondly, it has to do with the total nodes. I just need to know a little bit more about what is the business model behind the total nodes and how is it valued.
Okay, the second one is a whole hour-long talk.
Yes.
So why don't we do the first one?
Yeah. So maybe on the first one, I'll provide a bit of a generic answer first, and then maybe a little bit just on what you
We didn't hear the question.
Well,
yeah. So if I paraphrase and correct me if I was wrong, the question was more around digitizing assets and inspiring trust in counterparties that where you've got a serial number around the asset, like I have a bar of gold, or you do not have a serial number around the asset, right?
it's not possible.
Right, so let's say, it's a, I'm trying to think of something that does not have a serial number.
Right,
we all barcode it?
Diamond, maybe?
Yeah,
Well, they can do.
They can or whatever. The point there is that if I step back for a second and I think about assets, there's a bunch that are serial numbered, QR coded, barcoded, and they move through some kind of supply chain or they're somehow tracked, right? Those ones we can do, but what I would say is that even in that case, because it's a TODAQ file, we are probably concerned about more things necessarily than just a serial number, right? In terms of what are the other dimensions around a thing that we care about. What I'd also say is looking especially at a physical asset, often these things have a real-world ties to registration departments, regulatory bodies, other corporate standards and ways of governing, registering, controlling the movement of something, whatever that happens to be.
Governance?
Yes. So if we are picking something where it ties into one of those real-world things, then the immediate question from a private sector perspective becomes, okay, if we're going to go stick this on and get a whole bunch of efficiencies and advantage out of it, that is going to be necessarily limited because we have a dual system that is now operating in the rest of the world, where you don't have that efficiency, that kind of speed, that kind of immutability. So what we have done in our approach to say 4 things where there's either that complication or there isn't a a serial number or a set of numbers around it. What are the set of assets that companies and people care about that they do trade in, where either it's simple enough that we can define it in the TODA world, and we have either A, not too many external regulatory and registration bodies to deal with, and now it's moving around within a system, and we have a means of actually earning revenue on it, right? Because everyone here is a business, everyone gets it and has created a business. So you want to make sure as you're building things, you're also getting revenue because you're providing value that people are willing to pay for. The second then is, as an example, let's say we took something, and I just realized I can think of a whole class of things where you don't have a serial number. So think of SKRs within the banking world, which is trillions of dollars in size, but rather opaque in terms of how much transparency is around them. So SKR, by the way, is safekeeping receipts. And you have SKRs for pretty much everything, from a card to a piece of art to a diamond to you name it. And around those SKRs, there's all kinds of secondary markets, both private and otherwise, for the trade and secondary buying and selling of those things. But what is moving around is actually the piece of paper. Much in the same way that you went and stuck a bar of gold in the bank and you had a note, and then the note became currency. This is kind of existing like a bit in that opaque space. But now within that SKR, what you have to get around that issue of trust is you have a bank that says, this is the asset that is being owned, it's being held here, and that is the thing that's moving across. And people are still getting their trust somehow through an intermediary or something that's dealing with the counterparty risk. So whether it's a bank, whether it is an insurance policy, right? If you're dealing with a physical asset that doesn't have that registration kind of thing, you still need to solve for that delta somehow, right? The place where TODAQ Financial has gone is for the large sets of assets where it's insurance and banking, because that's our side. But there's a whole set of other things where there's other answers. Does that get at least a bit of what you're asking?
Awesome. Let's do one more question, ideally one that can be answered fairly quickly. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for a great presentation. My question is regarding the solution stack that you have described. I was wondering about the flexibility of TODAQ Financial's, that TODAQ Financial currently possesses in being able to answer and kind of tailor those solutions to clients, enterprises, big or small. And also, how do you see a future for that?
I'll provide half of it, and then I think Dan,
Sure.
you probably want to weigh in too. So the simple answer is we don't tailor, right? So as we are providing a platform, we are going standard, 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 which means that we say no to a bunch of things that don't fit a standard model platform as a service. I mean, over time, will we end up specializing and saying, this is the platform solution for this particular sector? Sure, we might, but right now it's just standard, and the good part is we found no lack of demand or scale to fill the standard answer.
Right.
I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of TODAQ in some ways as providing a platform that adds some additional services on top of a protocol. And then on top of that platform, of course, you can take that and customize it in many ways, and that's a huge opportunity for businesses to grow on top of that platform. We're looking at building an ecosystem on top of the TODA protocol, and that grows both vertically, as I've just described, but also horizontally, as you'll see through the rest of the day today. All right, great. Let's give Hassan another hand.